Researching the paranormal is fraught with complications and concerns. Chief amongst them, how on earth do you go about it in a way that is, at the very least, reasonably scientific? Considering many people consider the paranormal to be a pseudoscience, something which is outside the boundaries of scientific scrutiny, this is all the more difficult when you are trying to present to an audience. So before I go too deep in with this new channel, I wanted to take a moment to discuss my opinions about science v spirit and how I think it is best to approach the paranormal. But before we fire up our brain cells too much, I'm Laura and welcome to my channel. If you haven't done so already, why not consider subscribing so that you don't miss any of my future videos. Now let's continue. When discussing big ideas, I think it's always useful to start by defining what we mean by the component parts of a debate that we want to have. So in regards to the paranormal, this debate is often framed as a science versus spirit problem. But what do we mean by these terms? So if we start with spirit first, because I think this is actually the easier of the two. By spirit, I would say that we mean the concept of us as human beings within this universe having a soul or a consciousness, which is something that may not be intrinsically internal to our bodies. It may not be a biological process, so to speak, that it is reflective of a wider collective consciousness perhaps, and gives meaning and life to the wider universe. Now, the chief place that we might see this is in organized religions. So, of course, in Christianity, you have the idea of God, the creator, who made life and gave humans a purpose, gave humans free will in order to determine their own place in the world, very simply. So this brings in lots of ideas about consciousness and purpose and meaning. Of course, these ideas are not limited to organized religions. You can be spiritual without being religious, but I think the term spirit in this debate about how we approach the paranormal includes all these different belief structures. Then on the other side of this debate we have science. Now this, I think, is a much more complicated term to define, and one which, particularly in the present day, is very much taken for granted. I would actually argue that there are two sciences and that we need to be very careful not to confuse them. Primarily, science is a means of studying something, studying anything. And a scientific mindset, one which approaches study, we would expect to include things like observation, note-taking, data collection, things like that. We are observing something in order to get a better understanding of it. I think in its bare form, that's what science is, okay? But I'm very well aware that in the present day, science often isn't considered to be that. It is actually presented as the opposite of spirit, this worldview that sees us as humans having a soul, having consciousness, having purpose and meaning, and things being created by intelligent design. Science in the present day is often what I would say a materialistic, mechanical way of seeing the world. This mechanical, materialist, scientific view, the, if you like, type of science that we see most represented in the modern day, would believe that the world does not have consciousness, that it was not created through intelligent design, but rather as a consequence of a series of processes, mechanical processes, that nature is, if you like, a machine of sorts, that there is a biological evolutionary process of refinement where anything, in a sense, is possible, that these processes in a chain reaction could lead to anything being created, anything coming into being, and that it is not necessarily something that was intentional or purposeful or related to consciousness whatsoever. In fact, in the materialist mechanical way of seeing the world, there is no consciousness, or at the very least, consciousness is some form of illusion that we as humans perceive as a consequence of some biological process within the brain. In short, that when we die, anything that resembles consciousness dies with us because it is a byproduct of a very much mechanical, biological process. So you can see how this science and spirit approaches these two worldviews are at conflict with one another. One is very much about purpose and consciousness and the soul and meaning and intelligence behind the creation of everything that we see around us. And the other one is very much, there is no consciousness, there is no purpose, everything is mechanical, it is machine-like in this refinement process and can be boiled down to things that make sense at a fundamental level without any kind of secondary layer of meaning being associated with it. So while we may attach the word science to this way of seeing the world, that's only because this is the predominant way of conducting science. Science is the process of studying some sort of phenomenon. The predominant way of doing that studying, doing that science, is in the present day a materialistic, mechanical way of doing science. And thus in the terminology, science has just become that. There is no other way of doing science, if that makes sense. So we use the term science interchangeably with that one particular method of doing science. And so, at this point, I want to be very clear. There is not only one way of doing science. So in regards to the study of the paranormal, doing science in order to understand anomalous phenomena, things like life after death, you can start to see how the modern way of doing science becomes very problematic. This is the science, the material view, that there is no consciousness, that there is no external secondary factors that play a part on the basics, the fundamentals of life. So without wanting to look at this, without even believing that these sorts of things are possible, it makes it impossible to really study the paranormal. This is why the paranormal is often regarded as a pseudoscience by scientists who adhere to a materialistic worldview. And that is really unfortunate, because a lot of people, including quite potentially these scientists themselves, take for granted that the science they adhere to is actually a worldview. It is a belief much the same as people who hold spiritual beliefs. It is built on assumptions and built on unproven so-called facts. And I know this might sound very controversial, and what do I know, just sitting here telling you this. But this is not just something that I've made up or decided because of my dogma. It is actually a widely discussed and very hot topic within the scientific community, that there are actually a lot of issues with the way that science is done in the present day. And the more one looks at it, the more one starts to realise that there is a lot that's actually broken with the material, mechanical way of doing science. Consciousness really is the stumbling block of the materialist belief system. It's difficult even for the average non-scientific person to deny the existence of consciousness. And when you start looking at it with a scientific mindset, from a scientific line of inquiry, it's also very difficult to push the assumption that consciousness is a byproduct of a biological process within the brain. For example, there are reports and experiences from people who have been brain dead, clinically deceased, who say that they have experienced an out-of-body experience where they have been a discarnate consciousness, they've been themselves watching their dead body from an elevated position. Now, this suggests that consciousness can't be a mere byproduct of brain activity, because the brain is dead. And so that really is an issue with the materialist viewpoint. They can't explain that. That should be impossible, and yet it doesn't seem to be so. Even for those who like to push the argument that consciousness is some sort of human illusion, can't really maintain that stance, because the concept of illusion itself implies that consciousness is playing a part there. And so all of this considered should really make you realize that there is something truly wrong with the materialist way of seeing the world. Yes, of course, materialist science has given us much, lots of technological advances, but it has also left quite a lot out. And consciousness really is the big thing that the materialist viewpoint ignores. The cornerstone of modern science can be said to be objectivity. The idea that when we are doing an experiment, trying to understand something, that we want to strip that something down to its primary core truth, and that all the secondary layers, all the secondary elements related to that truth are stripped away, so that we hope to get a sense that the thing we're trying to study is in its more pure and true form. So to give an example of this in regards to the paranormal, studies involving mediumship might want to take someone who claims to be a medium and assess whether or not they can, as they claim, extrapolate information about the dead from someone that they are reading, okay? And to make this experiment objective, the researcher may, for example, want to make sure that the medium can't see the person who they are reading. The fear is that they may be contaminated, if you like, by secondary elements. So, for example, a medium is here to get a reading about a deceased person. We don't necessarily need that medium to be able to know whether the person they're reading is male or female, what colour hair they might have, how old they might be, what sort of clothes they might like to wear. All of these elements are considered secondary, are considered potential contaminants that will make the results generated by the experiment subjective, influenced by the medium, and not a true reflection of the phenomenon which is trying to be studied, i.e. whether or not they can get information from a supposed deceased person. So science, the modern method, the current method of doing science, would hope to strip away these elements and perhaps blindfold a medium, or put a medium in a different room from the person who they are attempting to read, so that they are just focused on producing objective results. The problem with this is that for a long time, there has been a debate over whether this is correct or even possible to do this. And in the past 10 years or so, there's been a replication crisis where a lot of these gold standard papers, these gold standard scientific studies, not necessarily to do with mediumship, but certainly in psychology, other social sciences, and also in biology and across all the sciences, these gold standard papers, when people have gone back to them, have been found to not necessarily always be replicable. So the concept is, if you've done a study properly using the principles of material science, objectivity, and removed all the fluff, all the secondary layers and elements that may influence a study, you should be able to replicate it over and over and over and get the same results each time. But this just isn't so. It's been proven, it just isn't so. And these gold standard papers, these scientific truths, have been found not to actually be as truthful as you might think. I hate statistics, but I'm going to give you some anyway to give you a better sense of the scale of this replication crisis. So, a report dating to December 2021 by the Reproducibility Project for Cancer Biology found that over the past 8 years, when they attempted to replicate 193 experiments from 53 different cancer research papers, only had a success rate of about a quarter. So that meant that 75% of the studies that they tried to repeat and get results that were the same failed. They were not able to do so. Again, a study from the journal Nature dating to May 2016 found that more than 70% of the 1,576 researchers that they interviewed had tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments. So this is not a small thing. This is quite a big deal in regards to material science. So why might this be? Is this because these studies weren't done correctly in the first place? Or is there actually something fundamentally wrong with the whole concept of objectivity? Now, there are a lot of scientists who would say, yes, absolutely, that the method is wrong entirely and that there is an illusion surrounding objectivity. Now, this is something that I spoke about with scientists including Dr. David Luke and Dr. Matthew Smith when I filmed for my documentary film In Search of the Dead back in 2017, and which in the years since I've looked into more and hopefully have a better understanding about. And it's the idea that it's quite basic when it's boiled down, that we're human. And if I'm a scientist and I'm going to be conducting an experiment, for example, with the mediums, and I, you know, segment them into a room away from such and such, blah, 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 that there still may be subjective factors that influence or contaminate my research, and that these are not necessarily taken into consideration when I write down my results and publish them in a journal. So, for example, I as a scientist may be pursuing a particular grant at my university, and this may put pressure on me to select data in a different way than I might otherwise, or I may have a rival. I might take shortcuts and expedite a process because I want to get ahead of my rival, or even subtle things like working with different mediums. Perhaps I strike up a rapport with one of them and get along quite well with them, and then another one, actually we don't quite click and don't get along very well. My treatment of them may be very different, and thus produce different results, even down to the fact that I, as the scientist, have set the question, set the parameters of my experiment. That is going to have an influence. What are my beliefs? What are my pre-existing ideas, my personal baggage, if you like, that I've brought to the experiment? It makes sense then that if another scientist later down the line were to try and replicate my study, they might not get the same results as me, because they're not me. And they're not in the same setting, they're not necessarily working with the same people. There are lots of little factors which combined, being different, might very well change the outcome of a study. And so science at a popular level does a very good job of convincing people, particularly non-scientific people, into thinking that everything that they know is fact. They produce textbooks and documentary films, and they have scientific leaders all reading from the same notes, if you like, that science knows everything, that everything can be boiled down to data and put down in a book and it's indisputable. But that's just not so. That is something which is presented, but under the surface, it has a lot of issues, even down to what you would think are fundamental laws of science, like, for example, the speed of light. When scientists have gone back through the records and looked at the different data that has been gathered over the decades, there is variance in the data which is gathered. The speed of light, so it seems, changes. Is this because the measurements are not being taken correctly? Is this because of some kind of experimenter bias or influence here? We're not quite sure, but it's much more complicated than you might think, and indeed that I'm even able of expressing properly. Someone who is particularly good at really teasing apart all the problems in the modern way of doing science is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. So if you are interested in this and you want someone to talk about it in a much more clear way than I'm able to, I definitely recommend that you read some of his things. And also, as I mentioned, Dr. David Luke, Dr. Matthew Smith, their work within parapsychology and looking at consciousness particularly is also very interesting. So what has this got to do with the paranormal? What am I even talking about here? There is a point, I promise you, and that point is that so often when people go out and research the paranormal, they fall into one of two camps, and that is the science camp or the spiritual camp. They either want to only use scientific methods, or what they perceive and have been told are scientific methods, or they, feeling alienated by that group, want to only use spiritual methods, things like mediumship and spirit boards, that often there's a wariness of crossing over the two. But I really do think that this is a false conflict, and one of the ways in which the paranormal would benefit in terms of research is to try and incorporate both approaches, but actually in a true and genuinely scientific way. So returning again to objectivity and this pursuit for objectivity in our research, we want to be scientific and skeptical. We should be that, truly skeptical. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should embrace objectivity as the supreme and only way of doing science. And I'll explain what I mean here. So subjectivity, again, is being influenced by these secondary factors, particularly those factors to do with yourself as a person, your perception of the thing that you are studying. And that may be to do with something as basic and physical as your vision. How do you see things versus someone else, or your belief structures and your past experiences, which may influence how you perceive something. So the prevailing scientific viewpoint would want to scrap as much subjectivity as they like and label science as objective, even when perhaps they themselves fall foul of that and are actually unable to achieve it because they will be influenced. But I think it's much more interesting to look at the subjective as potentially useful in regards to, well, studying anything, but particularly the paranormal. So what do I mean by this? I mean that your experience as a human being has value. In the words of Aristotle, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And in regards to studying the paranormal, I think this is very, very true. So it may be that when you are studying something inexplicable, that you are actually the necessary part to understanding what it is that you are studying. So for instance, I'm going to use mediumship again as an example, because I think this is especially interesting in terms of this debate, because mediums are often just completely disregarded as something that is unable to be studied scientifically. So if knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, might it then be necessary for you to play a subjective role within a paranormal experience? That if we blindfold a medium and deprive them of all of these secondary elements in an experiment, that may actually prevent them from being able to do what it is that they claim that they do. So a materialist, mechanical scientist would want them to purely focus on, if they can indeed speak with the dead, boiling it down to that biological component which they must have in order to be able to do that. They don't want any of the other layers or elements influencing or in the worst case contaminating that function that they are trying to study, that's communicating with the dead. But what happens if they need that? What happens if a medium, when they enter a space in order to experience the paranormal and commune with the dead, if that's what they're able to do, what happens if they need to see the colour of the person's hair that they're reading? They need to see how old that person might be. They need to see the photographs in the background behind them in the setting of their home in which they're reading them. It might not be that they're cheating, as perhaps a scientist would claim, but that these elements are actually necessary somehow for this process to happen. And in that case, the subjective, the experiential role within the paranormal does not become a contaminant, but actually a vital part of the process. And so all of this is to say that in my own research, I think it's really important that I am a part of the process. And when I go either to a location or experiment at home, I think it's really important that I express some of these secondary elements that I might be experiencing and share them as part of my research. It's not about trying to remove myself from the research, because I think that is impossible. It is impossible, but acknowledging them for what they are. Perhaps they are a contaminant in some cases that influence the outcome of research, but in some cases perhaps they are actually a necessary part. An example of this might be when I do stream of consciousness writing. So this is something that I've been doing for many years now and started doing when I was filming In Search of the Dead. And it is, if you perhaps like to categorize it as a form of mediumship. I attempt to get in tune with the location where I visit in order to do a paranormal investigation, for example, and just write down what I feel, what I think, any words or images that come to me. And I just write them down. By itself, perhaps that's not extremely useful and could be criticized heavily for being subjectively contaminated. For example, if I go to a location that I know things about already, whether that be just visibly, I'm at a castle and therefore I can see it's a castle, or perhaps even in a more detailed way, I know some of the actual history of that actual castle, my writing may be contaminated. And that is a fair point. Perhaps subjectivity needs to be considered in that way in this instance. But I think it gets a lot more interesting when you take that inherently subjective experience and then pair it up with evidence that's gathered in a different way. An example of this, recently I was in Bristol visiting the SS Great Britain, the first great ocean liner to cross the Atlantic, and I was actually on board this historic ship which has been restored to its original splendour. And I was walking around the different areas of the ship, and I actually decided to just do a little bit covert investigating and to do a stream of consciousness writing. So I sat, as I always do, just thinking about the environment that I'm in, just started writing a few words until I felt the words take me, and just wrote down whatever came to me. And I don't know where it came from or what it means or if it's anything other than my own imagination, but I had an image of a young man come into my head working on the ship, and that he felt very remorseful and regretful, as if he was carrying some great weight, a secret perhaps, that had influenced why he had joined the ship to begin with, in order to escape this past, perhaps something to do with a woman. And he was very sad. And I wrote this down. And interesting enough. And then I thought, well, it would be interesting to see, let's do something else and see if we can get anything that relates to what I just wrote down. So I then used GhostTube Seer, which is a mobile application which utilizes artificial intelligence in order to produce responses from environmental changes, which might possibly maybe influenced by any spirits present. So as soon as I did the stream of consciousness, I turned on GhostTube Seer and just asked how was there a man there, perhaps the man who had just showed me these images related to his life. And the first image that came up was of a person with their head in their house. And for me, that image was very much reflective of the emotion that I had just felt writing the stream of consciousness. So what's going on there? I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on there. But I thought it was very interesting that you had this relevance between these two very different methods of researching the paranormal. One is very much spiritual, getting in tune with perhaps our consciousness, the consciousness of some discarnate, deceased individual, and just feeling it and writing it down. And then the other one, taking very data-based scientific measurements from the environment and then displaying them in a different way, which uses technology. They couldn't be any more different, these two approaches, and yet somehow they managed to both produce a similar response. So I'm currently in the steerage part of the ship, and I just did a stream of consciousness, and I was imagining the boat, imagining it out on the ocean, just trying to get a sense of the vessel itself, and I felt really strongly about a man working on board below deck in the engine, shoveling coals, sweaty and hot, that sort of thing. And in particular, I felt this overwhelming sense of shame.
Moonlight, water, coming into dock, shine on the sea, swelling, a lighthouse to guide us to shore. There is something below deck, a monster of coal and sweat and shame. Strangely, a man with sweat on his brow, eyes wet from work. He has left a woman, cold, now old, but cannot forget her. Why shame? What is the secret only he knows, and why is his father the only one to know? Mother dead and in the grave, died in childbirth. He has not come to seek his fortune, but to run away from the shame of the woman on the swell of the sea. He hopes to die and become a part of the eternal ocean.
And so if we are achieving these sorts of interesting responses using methods, spiritual methods, that do not necessarily meet the criteria of scientists who adhere to the prevailing materialist, mechanical belief of doing science, what do we do with them? Do we just simply dismiss them? They're not materialistic, they're not data-based, they're not objective, whatever that means. We should just ignore them. Surely that doesn't sound right? That if we're getting results that are interesting, we should be looking at why we're getting results. What's the cause of these results being achieved? Is it something completely non-paranormal? Well, that needs to be figured out. And if it is something inexplicable, something that doesn't seem to fit in a box determined by a material worldview, then we need to be exploring that as well. And in order to explore that, we shouldn't be afraid of turning to these more spiritual-based beliefs. Because although they may be beliefs, the material way of doing science, they are beliefs as well. Now, of course, that's not to say that the spiritual worldview is completely perfect. Of course it's not. There is so much dogma within that way of seeing the world as well, particularly, of course, within religious institutions. I really do not need to get into a debate over this. There are problems, just as there are problems on the science side. But someone arguing from the science side would try and, I think, aggressively say that because there are these problems on the spiritual side, that we should just dismiss the whole way of doing it. But I could say the same thing about their side. If they can't prove to me that their objective study is replicable, which they can't in many cases, then should we just dismiss all of science as well? No, of course not. It's ludicrous. There are good things and bad things about both ways of doing science, and I think that should be quite straightforward. The problem comes when we start mixing our emotions into all of this, and we feel as though we are being attacked by the other side. We pick a side and that we feel as though we're being attacked by the other side. And unfortunately, this does happen. We're human beings, which is what all this boils down to, that we can't deny the human element in anything. In my attempts in order to balance these two approaches, which is never going to be perfect, but my attempts nonetheless, I like to try and mix together both stereotypically spiritual approaches and stereotypically science approaches. So, for example, I have used spirit boards quite a lot, particularly to communicate with a specific person who presents themselves as a specific person called Eliza. And over the course of many spirit board sessions, I thought it would be interesting to see if she could, on command, if you like, produce an EVP, so electronic voice phenomena, a recording of her voice on a dictaphone. So what I did at the end of each spirit board session, I would introduce the dictaphone and ask her if she would like to try and say her name. And I did this repeatedly over several sessions to get her used to the machine that I'm asking her to use, because we shouldn't assume that she can necessarily even use this, let alone know how to do it the first time. So I would introduce it at the end of every session and give her the opportunity to respond to me asking, "Can you say your name, please?" And I did this for a couple of times, and then on one particular session, playing the audio back, I was quite astounded to have recorded what sounds to me very much like her saying her name.
July 22nd, 2022. Eliza. What's your name, please? Can you say your name, please? And again. Thank you. Can you say your name, please?
Now, I'll let you be the judge of what you think is going on in the recording. But for me, I do think that there is something going on there and something of interest. So what I think is very interesting is that something which is very material, an audio recording taken through a dictaphone sound, was generated seemingly on command by using spiritual means. So not merely just the spirit board, but the whole concept of making some form of emotional, spiritual connection with not only a deceased person, but a deceased person who has a discarnate consciousness, who's able to communicate back to you. This, according to the materialistic view of seeing the world, of doing science, shouldn't be possible, of course, and yet it seems very much like there was something going on. In this way, I think a healthy way to approach the paranormal is from this perspective of trying to get crossover evidence, particularly using techniques which are regarded as spiritual and regarded as scientific. Can you get similar results using these two different approaches, these two different ways of doing science? To me, that's very, very interesting if that's possible. And so I don't want you as the viewer to be surprised if you see Eric and I doing experiments that you might not consider to be very scholarly, for example, because they don't conform with the prevailing scientific way of seeing the world. We might experiment with mediumship and things like spirit boards, or doing an Estes method, things that the materialist, mechanically minded person might dismiss as not worth their time from a research point of view. Eric and I are certainly going to be experimenting with these different techniques. For example, in one of my recent videos, when he and I went to Aberystwyth Castle and were using Ghost Tube Seer in order to see if we could get any responses, Eric, although he's largely not on camera, was experimenting with seeing if he could get any sensations or images come to him whilst he was in the same space. And on one occasion, when I'm holding my phone with the application on it, an image starts to come into view, which to me looks very much like blood. It's very red and very overwhelming and very much like blood. And Eric can't see the screen, but at the very same moment where this image blooms into presence, he says, "Blood." And you can see it in the footage, although it's perhaps not supremely well presented because you can't see where Eric is or what he's doing or what he's looking at in that particular moment. But he was experimenting with visualization and seeing if he could get any senses. Now, I don't know if the image of blood has any actual relevance to Aberystwyth Castle and its history and any spirit people who were there in that moment trying to communicate with us. But I do think it's very, very interesting that both this application, which uses technology and artificial intelligence, and Eric, who was using the power of his own mind and his own consciousness, were able to see the same thing. Of course, we can ask all sorts of questions as to why that might be and what sort of environmental contaminants there may have been. But it's the very fact that we can ask these questions means that it's worth studying and shouldn't just be dismissed. I think this example also provides the opportunity to discuss the notion of coincidence, because I know this is the blank check of a lot of what I like to call material fundamentalists, who do not want to look at the spiritual side of life, who do not even think that it exists, and will just dismiss a lot of these sorts of inexplicable happenings as coincidence. For example, Eric and Sia both saw blood. It was just a coincidence. And of course, this might be so. There's no way for me to necessarily disprove that, but there's no way for them to necessarily prove it either. It's a bit of a lazy way of seeing the world to just dismiss everything as a coincidence and is built on assumptions in the same way that a dogmatic spiritual approach is also built on assumptions. Neither one can be proven. Neither viewpoint is superior to the other. Both are equally worthy of research, exploration, critique and comment. So that's something that I'm going to talk about more in future, and definitely the way that I want to approach the paranormal on this channel. And of course, I'm not perfect. I'm going to make lots of mistakes. That's just part of being human, but that's what makes it so interesting. And I hope that by doing this and sharing some of my opinions about this, I can empower other researchers to do the same and not be scared of contaminating themselves by venturing into the subjective. I think it is very important that we are honest with ourselves as humans and reflect upon who we are and what we might bring to what it is that we're studying. Not just that what we bring may potentially influence the outcome of our research, but that what we bring as individual people might be the component that makes the phenomenon what it is, makes it interesting, makes it meaningful, makes it even work, and that it's not a contaminant, that it actually is the crucial element. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much. I apologise if perhaps this was a little bit of a different sort of paranormal video than what you were expecting, but hopefully one that was interesting nonetheless. So go ahead, do your own research please, and of course share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like what you've seen, why not subscribe so that I can see you in the next one. Thank you.